Welcome to the Round 3 Accreditation Dialogue with the Council on Education for Public Health on Evaluation, Planning, and Implementation. This webinar is sponsored by the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health, Accreditation, and Credentialing Committee. This is the fourth webinar over the last year that ASPPH is undertaking with members and partners and our Council on Education for Public Health colleagues to help illuminate the criteria to give the opportunity for questions, answers, and conversation around optimal criteria that ASPPH will submit for our response to CEPH. We're in round 3, and we are looking to get your comments and feedback during this round to submit in a couple weeks. In the right-hand side of your screen in the portal, you'll find 4 handouts. You can click on these handouts. The first one is our draft round 3 response. The second one is CEPH's draft criteria, the narrative. The third is the draft CEPH data templates. And the fourth is the draft CEPH degree classification key. We look forward to hearing your questions and comments. You may submit them by typing into the box, again in the right-hand corner of your screen. Go ahead and start putting questions in now, and we will be answering them later on in the webinar. With us today is our webinar moderator, Dean David Goff of the Colorado School of Public Health. Dean Goff is chair of the ASPPH Accreditation and Credentialing Committee. Also with us are few of our ASPPH member counselors to CEPH. We have 4 counselors, and Dean Donna Peterson, the CEPH president of South Florida, may be joining us. Ms. Ruth Gare-Bernheim of the University of Virginia, we believe, will be joining. Dean John Finnegan will not be with us today, the University of Minnesota, and Dean Aman Hakim of the University of Arizona is with us today on the webinar. Thank you all for joining. We are very pleased to have our Council on Education for Public Health colleagues here in the office with us to present and discuss with you on the webinar, Ms. Laura Racer-King, Executive Director, and Ms. Molly Mulvanity, Deputy Director. David, the mic's yours.
All right, thank you very much. I think I should be unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I want to welcome you all to the webinar. This is our opportunity to, communicate and get your questions and your input with respect to this current round of responses to the proposed CEPH criteria. So thank you all for your time today. I also want to thank Liz for her excellent work in preparing us for this webinar and for our responses to date. Next slide, Liz, please. So the criteria that we are planning to respond to in this round are shown on this slide, and this relates to the feedback that we have gotten from the working groups that are looking at the criteria. Next slide, please. These are the different groups who have responded and contributed to the responses that we'll be submitting to CEPH as our response from the association during this round. So you can see we've had a lot of input from a lot of groups within our organization. I won't read this list to you, but just give you a moment to look at it. In addition to the response that will come formally from the association, we encourage you to comment directly to CEPH. It's always helpful to have multiple comments come in that reinforce key messages, and there may be messages that or comments that you and your institution feel very strongly about, for which there's a lack of consensus within the association. So we encourage you to submit your individual comments directly to CEPH. When you do so, we'd ask that you copy ASPPH, copy Liz, so that we know the comments that are going in from our members to CEPH. That would be helpful to us as we track things going forward. we try to develop a consensus through the process that we're having. It doesn't always work perfectly, of course, and so if you have a comment that you want to submit that doesn't show up in our consensus document, we would just like to know what that is when you submit it. Next slide. I don't know whether Donna's been able to join us yet. I believe Iman is prepared to give us a little bit of an update from the CEPH counselor perspective if Donna's not on. Donna, have you joined us?
She has not.
Okay. Iman, would you be willing to provide us with your perspective from the CEPH counselors?
Sure. Welcome everybody. We really, on behalf of myself and the CEPH, we appreciate all of you giving the time to be with us today. And your engagement, your feedback, and your comments are very well taken and discussed between the counselor and the staff. Everything counts, and we would love you to be engaged during the process until the end. And I'm looking forward, along with the CEPH today staff, to listening to the new comments, and Molly will be able to give you a good detail on the topics of today. Again, thank you, and keep the engagement, keep the issues coming. In the end, we are all looking to the same clear outcome to move the field forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. Molly, we'll turn it over to you for the next component.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. I'm going to start here with a slide that most of you have probably seen before. This is our timeline. 3 years in process, and they are just flying by. But as you can see, we've got a number of steps left in the process between June and November, listed at the bottom there. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit about evaluation and assessment issues. And so I sort of wanted to start by reminding us of the focus of a lot of these criteria revisions, which is bringing a new perspective to try. We have heard the feedback loud and clear, and we certainly believe that it is part of best practice in accreditation to focus on outcomes where we can, and inputs only when necessary. And so that sounds wonderful in theory, but we need to sort of implement that and operationalize that and break it down into our criteria. And so the primary mechanism is by the structure that you see here, very similar to the existing structure in our accreditation criteria. But when we get down to that last item, where currently we require measurable objectives and 3 years of data, we've introduced multiple measures and a great deal of additional flexibility. And so although that is, although many aspects of the architecture of evaluation and assessment are similar, there's actually quite a bit of variation because of that alteration of the last item. So there's several layers to the process of the sort of multiple measures. And the first one is this. It appears early on in the criteria, and basically what we say is that we want you to have appropriate methods and measures to allow you to determine the school or program's effectiveness in advancing its mission and goals. Very similar to what we have now, except again, you'll note the more open-ended statement about appropriate methods and measures. We do say a little bit about what needs to be included in that, and a comprehensive evaluation plan. That is, again, very parallel to where we are right now, but I think that in some ways, what we're doing by introducing flexibility is raising the bar a little bit. We had a very clear architecture with our templates and our objectives, target, 3 years of data. That was a very clear architecture. We're stepping back from some of that prescriptiveness, but we're saying just because you develop your own format, we want to still ensure that it is comprehensive and that it is not sort of, what's the word, ad hoc or delivered and implemented only in time for each accreditation review. We named 2 key aspects that we think everybody who is in an accredited school or program, we hope, is interested in advancing the field of public health and ensuring student success. And we believe that sort of by naming those in the criteria,
we can help our reviewers and schools and programs weed out what is important to measure and what isn't. There's still a great deal of subjectivity in how you would define, operationalize, and measure those two factors. But by sort of stating some broad unifying themes, we can focus everybody's attention on perhaps what is truly important at the end of the day. So our approach in the revised criteria has a lot of parallels with our current criterion 1.2 on evaluation and planning. Particularly, I noted evidence of regular implementation rather than the SL study process every 7 years that dredges up some data. The second layer, in addition to that sort of open-ended yet emphasis on comprehensive aspect, is evidence of student success. This is important. We've mentioned this a lot in our current criteria. This is very important to the U.S. Department of Education, who recognizes us as an accreditor in the field. This is taking a lot of attention and focus in national policy debates from both the legislative and executive branch. Evidence of student success, we think, is also important to us and to you. And so this is where we look at things like graduation rates, placement in, I'm sorry, not placement, but employment or enrollment in additional education after graduation, and then other measures of student success. We know that graduation rates and employment don't tell the whole story, but we need to be able to have a conversation as a field about how, if we disagree on those measures, how we might supplement them. What are some other measures of student success? Because at the end of the day, that's one of our most important aspects, as I noted, sort of as one of the two major themes that we cite in the evaluation criterion. The next layer is an approach that comes in a number of criteria, particularly in those related to faculty quantity and faculty quality. I think those are always hot button issues because those are places where the inputs versus outcomes line can get a little bit blurry. At some point, I think we've discussed this on some prior webinars, we want to increase flexibility, but at the end of the day, we are going to have to count faculty. I don't think we can envision moving to an accreditation system that just says, have any number of faculty you would like, and we will judge you only on your outcomes. I don't know if we even think it's a good idea to get there, but we're certainly not there now. So what we're doing, though, is saying that there's a sort of feedback loop, accountability measure. We want to know, obviously, do you have, are your resources sufficient? But then how do you know they're sufficient? And what's the evidence that you can provide for us for the decision that you've made internally, so that peer reviewers in the process can validate the school or program's own assertions or opinions about the sufficiency of the faculty complement. The next layer is in almost every criterion, and that is the self-assessment. Now, this exists in the criteria at the present day, and we ask everybody to give strengths, weaknesses, and plans. And I think in some criteria particularly, we see in reviews that these are not necessarily very satisfying in their current format. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a stretch to come up with a weakness or a concern for every criterion. Some of our criteria that exist are pretty straightforward and clear-cut. And sometimes the self-assessments, I think reviewers appreciate seeing an honest self-assessment, but it can be challenging in the current format to sort of provide. We ask schools and programs in the current criteria to first say one of our 4 compliance findings met, partially met with commentary, or not met. And I think that forces a type of thinking that can be, can inhibit in some ways a real critical discussion about possible areas of improvement. So we've made this, I think, introducing just a small amount of change in the wording and removing the idea of self-assessing using one of the 4 procedural options. We hope that that will open up the discussion a little bit and invite a little more self-criticism and reflection. At this point, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to answer questions and have discussions, but it's important that we talk about the next steps. As you know, comments are due to us. David talked about submitting comments to us directly, as well as copying ASPPH if you wish. We are going to have the next draft of the criteria out as soon as humanly possible after our June meeting. We're definitely targeting mid-July at the latest, and then the next period will begin. So the next comment period due date is going to be in mid-September, and then we will be on our way to release a criteria, a final set of criteria and an implementation plan. And we're certainly still in the process as we refine each draft of the criteria. We get a little bit closer in understanding the magnitude of the changes and the specifics of the changes. Having a good handle on what exactly the new criteria are going to look like and what they're going to require in specific is really important to being able to develop an effective implementation plan. So I know that everybody is very eager to discuss implementation and you know, the specifics of that. And I want to assure you that we're absolutely focused on that, absolutely thinking about that, but we want to make the best implementation plan we can, and to do so is certainly going to require having a bit more detail on what the criteria are going to look like in the final analysis. So with that, I also encourage you in continuing to submit your comments. The comments we've received so far, those of you who've submitted, I hope you can see that your comments were extremely helpful and influential. And a lot of times we are able to see something in a new light that was not abundant or that was not clear before, or some specific suggestions that just wouldn't have been apparent to the council, but are apparent through your own experience and expertise. So I hope you understand how much we value the comments, and will continue to comment both in this current period through May 16th and in the period that's going to take place from July through September. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. Now on to our listening audience. We have a few questions in the question box. If you have anything to ask or comment on, go ahead and submit it using the method that you see there on your screen. Type it into the box. I'd like to encourage you all to check out the handouts, particularly the first handout, which is hot off the press today, the draft ASPPH Round 3 response. We're very eager to hear what you have to say about the proposed changes to the criteria. When you are registering for the webinar, we invited comments and questions, and the first one we will take from the pre-registration box, and that is a statement. CEPH should state the equivalent to clarify 42 semester credits is equal to how many quarter credits. Is that possible?
It is. The answer is 56, and it is absolutely possible for us to put that in the criteria.
Wow, that was easy. Thank you, Molly. The next question we received in advance of the webinar is, how will site visitors get trained for ensuring a uniform interpretation of the new criteria?
Yeah, I really appreciate this criteria, and I think this is part of what I was mentioning, that we are all really sort of eager to know the details of implementation. We will train our site visitors in using a lot of the same methods that we use today to train our site visitors. And even if we didn't believe that it was really important to formally retrain all of our visitors in the criteria as they're revised, it is a regulation imposed on us by our responsibility to the U.S. Department of Education that we have to provide site visitor training at certain intervals, and this is one of them. So what we typically do, for those of you, I know we have some site visitors actually on this webinar, but for those of you who aren't familiar, what we've been doing is a full day, about 7-hour initial training, which involves PowerPoints, small group discussion, large group discussion including case studies, and a simulated writing exercise. So I expect we'll continue to use some of those methodologies. However, we are going to be introducing much more use of distance-based methods for training and updating site visitors. Maintaining site visitor currency, even when we're not in a period of significant criteria revision, is a major priority. And we've been paying a great deal more attention to it, I would say, in recent years than maybe we did as an agency historically. I think that's something we've seen a reasonable amount of improvement, and I expect we'll continue to see improvement. CEPH is really committed to ensuring the most consistent and high-quality reviews, and to do that, we have excellent site visitors already. What we need to do is provide them with the training and support to help them do their jobs we know that site visitors are all busy with full-time careers, and accreditation isn't their primary focus in their daily lives. So what we do as CEPH staff is try to provide a lot of technical assistance and support, both in terms of providing documentation and templates and helpful hints, as well as providing the staff support that we provide on each site visit to help site visitors be able to focus on just doing their job in the best and most consistent way.
The other thing that I wanted to mention there as well is that, as you know, and I'm sure most of you on the call at some point or another have worked with the CEPH staff. We are one of the agencies that's lucky enough to have staff support on every site visit, as Molly mentioned, and we are also working internally to ensure that there's consistency among reviews among the staff so that the staff can better help the teams, and that is something that we've already implemented. So we have a staff manager. The staff are meeting together specifically to talk about how interpretations happen. When we have council meetings, we bring their interpretations back to the staff and make sure we're sharing them so that the staff are able to consistently guide the teams. And we realize that that will be something that's even more important as we're implementing new criteria. So that is something that we're absolutely focused on.
Thank you, Molly and Laura. Now to the question box. Thanks. We have a number of questions in there. I'll try to go through them in a reasonable manner and try to connect ones that may be similar. First one, I'm a bit uncertain about D1, and that's the MPH and DRPH foundational public health knowledge, specifically as it relates to how a school would validate public health knowledge through appropriate methods. For example, could completion of a degree program other than a CEPH accredited bachelor's degree in public health or MPH degree be acceptable? Conversely, is simply completing a CEPH accredited degree program acceptable, or is some further documentation necessary? Do each of the 14, and by 14 the questioner is referring to the 14 competencies listed here in D1, need to be individually ensured?
Okay, so this is that was a complicated but very good question. Let me back up a little step and talk about what this criterion is. Those of you who've been following all the twists and turns, and that is a reasonable number of you, will recognize the evolution of this particular criterion. So in our first draft of proposed revised criteria, we talked about skills, knowledge, and professional disposition. And we had a long list of each. And these items that you see here in D1 were mostly the knowledge. That is, these aren't things that explain public health history, is not the level of skill that we were thinking of associating with an MPH or a DRPH. But we felt that that's an important piece of content knowledge that it would be important to validate that any graduate of an accredited MPH or DRPH possessed. So the first draft, these were in that bucket called knowledge. In the second draft, we folded skills and knowledge together, but we had a very large set of competencies. And so in this last draft, we took a lot of the excellent suggestions that you all provided and made a much more streamlined set of competencies for both the MPH and the DRPH. But what that did is it left us with this awkward space of some things that we felt that, gosh, it would be a real, I don't know if even shame is the word, but it would be unfortunate if we allowed people to graduate from an MPH or DRPH program who didn't have certain pieces of specific content knowledge, like the ones that you're listing here. And so we were trying to find a way to fold them back in somehow. They didn't quite rise to the level that we wanted to place in the competency list, but we wanted to make sure that they were there because they're fairly fundamental to, if you look at a number of the skills and competencies, they're similar to other fields, social work, in some ways urban planning, public administration, Master of Science in nursing in some cases. So we wanted to say what makes us different, and in part this content is what makes us different. It's not the only thing, but it's an important aspect. So that is a long history lesson. Back to the specifics of the question that was asked. When we decided to put these back in the criteria, the council really wanted to be very flexible. I've been using that word a lot, but it's appropriate here. Wanted to be very flexible in how a program might ascertain that a student had attained these. So some ideas that we thought of show up there in the criteria, that you might have an online or in-person class that did all of the types of assessments that you would do with any online or in-person course or class session. There might be independent tutorials or readings. There might be an examination or other type of assessment tool that was not linked to a specific class. Then we sort of thought, well, these concepts are certainly embedded in and required of our bachelor's degrees in public health, in our standalone baccalaureate criteria, and of course in our now in these revised graduate criteria. So we believe that if somebody had graduated from a program that had successfully demonstrated compliance with either our standalone baccalaureate program criteria or the criteria that we're proposing here, that it would perhaps be redundant to require completion or demonstration of these particular skills. So that was sort of almost, I don't want to say a benefit, but a way of reducing the burden and possibly another option. Now, would it work for completion of another degree program? Well, obviously not as a matter of routine. However, if there are circumstances in which the program or school wishes to review a student's transcript and past experience, and that student has completed an introductory public health class, and the school or program wishes to review that coursework and determine in the judgment of faculty and or staff at the school or program, if that those individuals determine through their judgment that that previous coursework satisfies these particular fundamental knowledge, then absolutely you could grant credit for completion of something at a baccalaureate level in a previous degree. This is intended to be very open-ended. It's intended to fulfill the purpose that we wanted to have at the end of the day, which is making sure that we have that content knowledge that makes us public health and makes us separate. We are open to suggestions on this, though, because it is a little bit of a new, it was a little bit novel the way it's presented in this particular draft. So we hope that you will have good suggestions to send in during this comment period.
The other thing that Molly didn't mention, which is another option that anyone could do, is simply map them to the curriculum that you have. So the main reason for this standard is that we understand that that your students come with a whole variety of experiences. So let's say that you have a Drph program, and you are accepting somebody who happens to have, I don't know, a degree in fine arts, and they're a master's degree, and they're entering your Drph program. Entirely plausible, but that person was pretty unlikely to have had these basic public health concepts in their previous education. So what this is really doing is saying, you can simply incorporate it into your curriculum and map it, and that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about it. But for many of our programs, they're already getting most of their classes working professionals in public health, for example. In that case, it might be a really good idea for them to have an exam to test out of these things. Maybe they didn't get it in formal education, but maybe they have it all from their work experience. Another program may have a lot of baccalaureate degrees in public health that directly feed in. And they're able to analyze the curriculum and ensure that students have those concepts through that. So it really is meant to allow the school or program to look specifically at its student body and figure out the best option for them.
And I'm so glad Laura mentioned that. I think I got lost in the complexity of the answer and forgot the most simple layer of the answer. The feedback that I've been getting initially from folks who've examined these knowledge areas is that these are almost gimmies for a lot of programs or schools. These are already well embedded in the curriculum and would not be a challenge to document in the existing curriculum as it is.
Thank you, Molly and Laura. If folks are able to access that first handout, which is the ASPPH draft recommendations, you'll see that there are a couple
draft recommendations about D1, and one is to separate the MPH from the Drph foundation seeds, and the other is to distill the D1 and to fold the MPH specific one into one set of competencies. So we'd really like to hear your thoughts on those two draft recommendations. There are some other questions I'm going to go to from the question box. One goes to you, Molly. It relates to your last slide that talked about first SVs with new criteria will likely be in 2018. What does that mean? Could you please clarify?
Yes. So again, with the caution that we do not have an implementation timeline yet. We do not anticipate, and I feel confident in saying this part, we do not anticipate that any site visits that are actually occurring, as in the actual site visit days, that are actually occurring before 2018, that would be too soon for a variety of reasons. You would have to rewrite your self-study. You know, there are all kinds of procedural as well as good practice as well as just simple human kindness reasons. We also, though, want to ensure that these criteria are implemented in a timely fashion. So we cannot continue to do site visits indefinitely using the existing criteria once we've adopted new ones. From every bit of past experience that we've had, and from what I know in terms of our procedural timelines, I believe that site visits starting in fall of 2018 are possibly going to occur using existing criteria. So if you have a site visit prior to fall of 2018, I do not suspect that conducting a site visit with revised criteria will be required. Fall 2018, so starting with September, and any site visit that would occur after that. So what that means is if you have an accreditation term that expires on July 1st, 2018, your site visit occurs in the spring of 2018. If you have a site visit if you have an accreditation term that expires on December 31st, 2018, then you will have one of those fall site visits that I'm talking about. Now, I've been hedging a lot in my language. I'm sort of proceeding slowly because I need to emphasize that this is a staff opinion based on my knowledge of council discussions and past actions and procedural timelines. I don't have the ability to tell you today what's going to happen for sure.
Okay, thank you, Molly. And so just to be clear, SV means site visit, to call that one out. Check for our CEPH counselors on the line. Ruth Gehr-Bernheim, have you joined? We want to make sure if you're on that we can hear you. We're not able to hear you if you're on, Ruth. So if you could type in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Now we can.
Great,
thanks. So feel free to chime in as you see fit. I'll go on to the next question. It relates to timeline. If an MPH program is now being revamped, where this is expected to be completed by spring 2017, should we focus on the new criteria or the current criteria?
Okay, this is a tricky one because we don't have any new criteria yet. And so it's very difficult for us to give you the degree of certainty that I believe you would like, and understandably you would like. What we're going to be doing is with folks who fall into these sort of unusual situations, we're going to be working with you one-on-one. So the person who asked that question, you are welcome to call or email me, and we can set up a time to talk through the intricacy of your accreditation term, the changes you're planning to implement, and all of those kinds of things. We are trying to be, I think the overarching principle, or one of them, that the council's following in implementation is we're trying to be sensible. That is, we wouldn't want somebody to have to expend a bunch of effort and do a bunch of busy work to comply with a set of criteria that is becoming obsolete. However, we must continue to follow the criteria that are adopted. We don't have new criteria yet. And so I think it would also be irresponsible for me to give the advice to sort of just plan on those and throw out the existing criteria today. That's just not feasible for a variety of reasons. So we're going to have to handle these cases on a one-on-one basis. We're going to have a lot more certainty as summer turns into fall. After this June council meeting, we'll have some more discussions, we'll have some more ideas under our belt, and as time goes on, we're going to really firm up in our understanding of how things are going to unfold. At this time, I think that's going to have to be a very individual question for the questioner and any others who see themselves in that potential point of view.
I would certainly assume, though, just sort of very pragmatically, the 2011 criteria are very different than the 2016 criteria will be, and the 2011 criteria are not coming back. We're way too far down the road for that. So if I were going to focus, I would definitely look more toward the 2016 criteria and not revamp a program based on the 2011, which we know are going to be vastly different. But having said that, Molly is absolutely right. It's really individual.
Okay. The next few questions relate to the DRPH, so I'm going to bundle those. The first one, how are schools expected to distinguish triage, students eligible for and/or advised to pursue the DRPH versus the PhD or the SCD?
So what we have in the proposed criteria revisions is a lot more definition around the DRPH than we have ever had historically. And I suspect that although the details of that are still being worked out, and there are a lot of areas, I think, in which we'll benefit from advancing in these comment periods, the DRPH is going to be much more clearly defined in the ways that you can see in the draft, although the details may change a bit. The PhD is going to continue to be less specifically defined as it is in the existing criteria. So I think that schools and programs are going to have some flexibility, there's that word again, to make PhD and SCD programs to fit their own and their student population's needs. They will also have flexibility to make their DRPH programs meet their own community's needs. However, the DRPH programs will have a certain degree of standardization across schools and programs. So I think the answer is that that decision will be very specific to every school and program who offers multiple doctoral degrees. But the caveat is that schools and programs will continue to have more what I would describe as flexibility, less definition for PhD and SCD degrees than the DRPH.
Thanks, Molly. And I'd like to commend the DRPH degree framing group, which is led by Jim Rosinski at the University of Arkansas, for working with about 16 of our members and partners, including practitioners, to help define the DRPH degree much better in this round. Next DRPH question. If DRPH applicants do not have an MPH or they have one from another school, would they be expected to take the host school's core courses or other requirements of the host school's MPH degree?
So the first part of the answer is let's throw out the language of core courses for now. I think when we think core courses, we think the 5 core areas, we think the current paradigm, and that is going away. So let's not even use that language. The criteria that we have proposed define a knowledge set, which is that D1 that we discussed at great length earlier, that everybody needs to have, regardless of degree level between master's and DRPH. The criteria define competencies that are at an appropriately advanced level. We hope we're honing in on that for a DRPH student. So the idea, the logic, is that necessarily, in order to possess the high level of competence defined in the DRPH criteria, a student would need to have a certain type of background, that is the ability to perform at that level. If the student comes in and cannot perform at that level, whether that's because of previous degrees earned or the student's own aptitude, then that's the type of individual doctoral advising that we would expect takes place in every program. The intention is not to set up a series of prerequisite courses for the MPH that must be completed before the DRPH. So the intention is to define the expected performance and outcomes at each level, and students will get there in the way, especially with doctoral students, in the way that through consultation with faculty and advisors.
It's also one of the main reasons, it's a good question, because it kind of takes us back to the D1 question. That is one of the main reasons why we did not separate out the knowledge that's required, the public health knowledge that's required between MPH and DRPH students, because we were specifically thinking about the DRPH, knowing that some programs will require an MPH to have already been earned, and then very likely those students already have those knowledge areas. That's a case where a verification by a test, for example, or by just having individual transcript review, that's a case where that might work, where the same program may take DRPH students that have never had a public health course before, which is completely fine. That is really up to the school or program and its own policies and goals on admission. But that is one of the primary reasons that they arranged for D1 the way that they did, so that won't even be a question. Each student will either have that knowledge or not. If they don't have the knowledge, then they have to gain it somehow. And again, that could be through the DRPH program itself and the curriculum itself, or it could be through a separate course, or it could be through readings. It kind of goes back to the D1 area.
Okay. Thank you. We have a number of questions still, and there are about 18 more minutes left in the webinar, which we'll be able to get through these no problem. So go ahead and type in additional questions if you're sitting on them or thinking about asking. Next question is back to D1. D1 has links to most of the traditional areas in public health, epidemiology, health policy, behavioral science, and environmental health, but does not mention biostatistical skills. Is there a specific motivation for this?
No. That is a very easy question to answer. No. And we are absolutely open to edits. We've already received some in this particular round of comments that are great suggestions on how to incorporate other concepts in here that might be representative of the area of biostatistics. So we absolutely welcome those. That was certainly not some kind of intentional move. This is exactly why we have this beautiful iterative process.
Okay. Question about site visit teams. Can we be assured that site visit teams will have at least one DRPH degree holder, preferably more, who can reflect from their experience with the degree?
I think the answer is no, and that answer is candidly because of the many factors that go into our selection of our site visit teams and our site visitor pool. Not every member of our teams currently has an MPH. Some have PhDs, some have MDs. So what we have to do on every site visit team is, number one, assure that site visitors are trained to the criteria and are experienced in interpreting them regardless of that individual's own experience. And number two, rely on the expertise of the blend of the team. And we've also found that there are some site visitors who are really excellent thinkers and interpreters that will be excellent on a team at an institution or degree program that is very different to their own, but they can give a really beautiful and thorough review. So I definitely hear the perspective that questioner is coming from, but I'm going to be candid in saying I don't think that is something that we'll be implementing.
Okay. Next are a couple of comments. The first is I would support the separation of the DRPH and MPH competencies. The crossover with MPH and DRPH should be much more delineated for student and professional success.
So I'm actually not sure that I understand that comment / question. I think you're referring to D1 again, and Laura mentioned our motivation for keeping D1 as a single criterion. Be interested in hearing more of your perspective on supporting a divergence or a separate delineation, and would definitely need to see some suggestions. You know, if you have an idea that what we have here looks like MPH and you would like to see something different for DRPH, we're going to need to see some suggested language. So I don't fully understand the idea, but I would welcome commenters to sort of elaborate on that and help us understand the idea.
The competencies themselves for the MPH degree and the DRPH degree are separate currently. Right, which is why Molly's saying that D1 may be what you're referring to. But again, my guess is, depending on the program, that many MPH programs will actually integrate those competencies throughout their curriculum, which would meet that standard. The intent was actually for the DRPH to have more flexibility in the kinds of students that it enrolled, and many more options for the students to gain those competencies prior to going, or not even prior to, it could be in conjunction with their DRPH competencies. Okay. Another comment, CEPH appears to interpret competency as skill only, whereas a comprehensive definition of competency includes knowledge, attributes, and skills. Thus, ASPPH feedback to combine the two sets rather than separating out content / knowledge is as a separate competency.
I think that comment is well taken in the sense that I tend to use skill as shorthand instead of saying knowledge, skills, and abilities when we talk about competencies. But we really have to back up and talk about this whole framework. You know, it's back to D1 again. So I think, you know, if we have the idea of folding these into the MPH and DRPH competencies, I think that is going to remove some of the flexibility that we had intended. If there are other outcomes that would be gained by that, sacrificing that flexibility, then we'd be happy to think about those and talk through them. But I think that to fold what we currently are calling foundational public health knowledge into the competency set may have some unintended consequences, and I just want to be sure that we think through all of those very clearly. But again, suggested language is always helpful, because sometimes we receive something in comments, as I said, that are sort of aha moments that we just didn't get it before, and somebody has a brilliant insight, and the more specific the language and the suggestions, the better we're able to have those insights that you can help us with.
Okay. Still on D1 for the next question, I believe, if I'm reading it right. Beyond the mapping of the foundational knowledge to courses, what at the individual level of assessment must be evidenced? For example, let's say there were 2 test questions to evidence the student's knowledge of a particular element of the 14-item list, and the student got those questions wrong on the test. Does that mean if the student does not pass a retest, having had some supplemental education, that the assessment function at the individual level has not been carried out adequately?
You know, that's a very rigorous and I would say granular question. And this is actually one of those areas where I would say, you know, I'm going to go back and invoke those words, peer review. I think our position, you know, in conducting accreditation reviews is to allow some discretion for faculty members and administrators at schools and programs to make decisions about appropriate assessment. And while we want to ensure that assessment is done and that it is done consistently, I think the council is not necessarily interested in going to the granular level. I think that we intend for our accreditation process to elicit discussions in schools and programs about assessment and about what the school or program thinks is appropriate, but I don't think we have an interest in being prescriptive at that granular level.
Okay. Great. And David, give you a heads up about the next question. It relates to line 27 on
the draft ASPPH response report. That's due to your involvement with the DRPH degree framing group that helped craft that recommendation. Now here's the question. Line 27 on the response report, how would transformative leaders be measured? Leadership implies experience, and a DRPH student would not have enough time to demonstrate a measurable outcome of a true transformative leadership experience. And here, you put it up on the screen. Go ahead.
Hi, this is David. Yes, point well made. I think one can have a goal in describing the purpose of a degree. I think it's also true that PhD programs often have the goal of developing scientists who are capable of becoming independently funded researchers, and it is very difficult to assess the success of that program or the success of that goal at the time of graduation with a doctoral degree. It is often at least a decade or so postdoctoral before one can truly be able to determine whether someone is successful at transitioning into being an independent scientist, and that doesn't change the goal of PhD programs from producing scientists capable of becoming independent researchers. And so I think in some ways, if you look at this text and you read it as what is the goal of DRPH education, it's about training people who will become transformative academic and practice leaders in public health practice and research and academic public health. So hopefully the intent is clear. The assessment of student success and student outcomes will fall short of knowing with great certainty what these graduates will be able to do in their professional careers to a similar extent as we'll have with other doctoral degrees. But I hope that helps.
Thank you, David. There are a couple comments, and then after that, one remaining kind of a double-pronged question. So we'll definitely be able to get through these before we wrap up here. The comment is back to D1. I think you're suggesting D1 for the MPH as an educational outcome and as an entry expectation for the DRPH. I would expect a higher level foundational outcome for the DRPH requiring differentiation.
I think the answer is that that is not the intention. But again, there seems to be some interest in exploring differentiation. So I'm really going to encourage folks who are interested in this to give us some suggestive verbiage. And again, to sort of help us understand how we can perhaps mitigate or alleviate some of the concerns that we have about differentiation. So, but the questioner's premise is not our intention.
Please also keep in mind that that this is the minimum. This is the minimum expectation. So any school or program can go above and beyond this expectation, certainly. So I think that's important to also remember.
This is David. I'd like to weigh in here. I think part of the comment is absolutely true. It is an expectation that all PH graduates would have this foundational knowledge. Okay, so that's clearly an educational outcome of an MPH program. Some MPH students may bring some of this knowledge into their MPH program with them based on an undergraduate degree in public health, as an example. It's also clearly the case that it's an expectation that all DRPH graduates would have at least this level of fundamental knowledge. They may bring it in from having had an MPH previously, or they may develop it during their DRPH experience. And so I think that's That's the way that I look at this with respect to this particular question. Now, it may be that there is additional foundational knowledge expected of a DRPH graduate, which would be a good reason to have an additional list, a supplemental list that would apply to DRPH students only or DRPH graduates only. And if there are such knowledge domains that people on the call would like to propose for the DRPH graduates, it would be welcome. Those comments would be welcome.
Okay, and on to the last question. Can you clarify more the difference between the MPH degree and the MSPH degree? I thought it was the MSPH is more research-oriented and the MPH is more practice-oriented. And if that is correct, is then an MPH graduate, practitioner, only able to go for a DRPH or can also go for a PhD in the future?
So this is a question that's it's a little bit specific, but it's also sort of an important distinction if folks are wondering about this. The MSPH has different definitions and functions in different schools and programs that we accredit. In some institutions, the MSPH is intended to be essentially an equivalent degree to an MPH. It's different for historical, it has a different name for historical reasons or some other reasons that are very specific to the school and program. So we have a couple of accredited programs that do not offer an MPH at all. They offer an MSPH and it functions like what the rest of you would picture as an MPH. There are other schools and programs that we accredit that use the ASPPH as something more equivalent to what you would think of as an MS degree, as a research-based degree that is not intended to be parallel to the MPH. So the MSPH is one that I can't really make generalizations about. So that's part one of the question. Part two is everything we've been sort of discussing in terms of D1, in terms of the flexibility and I guess even heightened flexibility of PhD and SCD programs as compared to DRPH, mean that we do not intend to set any parameters over what an MPH student would be qualified to do in terms of DRPH, PhD, another degree program following graduation. And we're also trying to, we are taking the approach of avoiding saying what degrees a DRPH student would come in with. So there is not an intended pathway of MS to PhD, MPH to DRPH. That may make a lot of sense for some schools and programs. That is not something we intend to embed in the accreditation criteria.
All we require in terms of admissions criteria is that you have a process to admit qualified students as you see qualified for your degree programs. There's no other, we don't even think about what kinds of degrees can come in and out of any program.
Yeah, and this is David. I'll just add another perspective on that to be very specific. You can let both MPH and MS degree holders into your PhD program. They might require different courses of study after entry based on the previous exposure they've had and the previous competencies they've developed.
We appreciate all that great Q&A. On to David for our wrap-up.
Also, thanks. The hour has flown by, and we didn't even talk too much about how to count faculty, which I thought would take quite a bit of time on this call. So, interesting where the comments came from today. I encourage you to submit additional comments and questions through the online community, because we are working very diligently to pull together the consensus comments from our association. You see this timeline. Our next steps are to get a draft of this out to members for review. That's going to happen in the coming days. You see a current draft. That's one of the handouts, ASPPH Round 3 Draft Response to CEPH. That will be coming around to all schools and programs in the coming days for review and response. Our response is due to CEPH in mid-May. Then CEPH will release round 4 of these criteria, as you heard earlier today, in early to mid-July. And then we'll have an opportunity to provide additional input on some of these outstanding issues. Next slide, please. So please continue to send your comments in to Liz. There's also the online accreditation review group. The next slide after this one will have the instructions on how to get to the online community. And this webinar will be posted at that online community. So ASPPH online community, that's where to continue to submit your comments and to respond to other people's comments so that we can have a dialogue over the coming days. Next slide, please. So thank you for being on the call. Thanks to Molly and Laura from CEPH for coming on and responding and providing such good information. And thanks in particular to Liz for organizing all this. So thanks so much. Have a great day. Liz, any last words?
No, thanks very much, and the webinar is now adjourned.